Okay, all rise. Court is now in session. We're calling the case of CR-0128941. That is the state versus Jack Goldsmith. All people having business in this court may be seated. Counsel for the prosecution, are you ready to proceed?
Yeah.
Counsel for the defense, are you ready to proceed?
Yes.
You may begin.
Graciously, thank you all. As our client, Richard, quivered in fear for his life from atop the beanstalk, the accused, Jack, hacked and hacked and hacked away at the base of a beanstalk with an axe, fervently determined to bring Richard down to the ground to his death. As Richard's wife peered over from above, observing the hundreds and hundreds of feet her husband was about to plunge, she shook with terror. The accused continued to labor on the ground, tenaciously slashing away at the base of the beanstalk. You will hear he did not break, not for one moment. Jack was a man on a mission to kill. The evidence will show that on the day Jack attempted to murder my client, he had also robbed them of their gold and invaded their property, violating the sanctity of Richard and his wife's home. You will hear that the defendant, as he escaped away with a bag of gold coins, was pursued by Richard down the beanstalk. And he was, for the sole purpose of retrieving his stolen property. And as Richard became aware of his imminent death, he left his thoughts from the savage on the ground, moved them to his wife, Gilda, the woman he hoped she'd be able to lead a full life once he was gone. As Jack completed his sinister work, the beanstalk began to fall, and Richard closed his eyes. He awoke days later, lying in a hospital bed, finding that Jack had left him with 2 broken legs, 1 irreparably mangled arm, 8 fractured ribs, and lacerations covering his entire body. And although Richard was in excruciating pain, he was overcome with joy when his eyes met Gilda's, for he thought he would never see his wife ever again. And now, if you will, we would like to present some more details of what happened on that day, and how Jack left our client Richard lying in a hospital bed, broken and battered.
Let's go back to the day before Richard's fall. That morning, the defendant's mother tasked him with taking the family's cow and only source of income to the market to sell. On the way to the market, the defendant spoke to a man on the side of the road. When offered some magic beans for the family's cow, he gladly gave away the cow. His mother expressed great frustration with his selfish actions and threw the beans out. The following day, after climbing the beanstalk that grew from the magic beans, the defendant invaded Richard's home and, after being warned, stole Richard's gold. Richard, realizing that he had been stolen from, followed the defendant to try and reclaim his property. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, the defendant opted to try to kill Richard. Fortunately, he failed.
morning, Richard woke up early. He made breakfast like he'd made every morning since he and Gilda were married. He made pancakes, and he used the last eggs, so he went to the store to get some more. But upon returning, he found a massive beanstalk growing next to his home, and the door ajar. He rushed inside to check on Gilda to make sure that she was all right. And although he did recite a rhyme to ward off this intruder, he never laid a finger on it. What did he do? He gave a verbal no trespassing sign. Once Gilda came out and reassured him that she was fine, he calmed down. He went to take a nap. Jack woke up to find, Richard woke up to find that his gold was gone. The same gold that he uses to provide for his family. Yeah, he followed the defendant down the beanstalk to recuperate what was rightfully his. But he never thought that he would end up in the hospital.
Now, the defense may argue that the actions described were justified. They may claim that Richard has been involved in thefts among the townspeople. Although Richard has been blamed for these thefts, he has not been tried, and there is no proof of guilt, making this statement irrational. Most important, however, in this trial is not the petty thefts among the townspeople. There is a far bigger question at stake, and that is whether the accused committed attempted murder of an innocent person. In addition, the defense may argue that the accused acted in self-defense. However, self-defense requires only reasonable force in order to protect oneself from bodily harm. Richard never harmed the accused. He was merely fearful for his wife, Gilda. The law requires solely reasonable force is used. And Richard never committed physical malintent towards the accused, who attempted to kill him. Clearly, the accused was not acting in self-defense, while he continuously hacked at the beanstalk, while Richard clung on for dear life. And thus, this makes the accused's actions inexcusable.
Throughout the course of the events described here today, the defendant demonstrated malicious intent towards my client, Richard. He began by invading Richard's home, threatening the personal safety of his wife, Gilda. He then, after being warned, tried to steal Richard's gold, and he succeeded. After that, he fled the scene. Richard, trying to get back what was his, pursued. And during the course of that chase, the defendant attempted to murder him by chopping down the beanstalk, with Richard still on it. As this happened, and as you have been told, Gilda watched in terror as her husband clung to the beanstalk. And she watched as the defendant severed the base of the beanstalk, and her husband fell hundreds of feet to the earth. By a stroke of luck, Richard survived. But Gilda could just as easily be here today, a widow. Now, the defense is going to tell you that this was self-defense. But as we said, Richard never raised a finger against him. They are going to say that Richard threatened his life. But Richard acted out of fear for his wife's safety. And he never attempted to harm him. Now, at the end of the day, it is clear what transpired here. The defendant invaded Richard's home, threatened the safety of him and his wife, stole his property, and, after all of that, attempted to murder him. We cannot let a violent criminal such as this get away with these actions. Thank you.
Thank you. Counsel for defense, whenever you're ready.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I will grind his bones to make my bread. These are the words that accosted Jack, our defendant, a young poor boy, as he sat crouched, huddled, shivering in absolute fear, in a dark room in a land that was not his own. These were the words that brought Jack into a state of terror. This was not a verbal no trespassing sign. This was a death threat, explicit intent to kill someone. Our defendant. He rightfully feared for his life. And so, as he escaped down the beanstalk away from harm and saw the giant descending onto his home, he used reasonable force to protect his mother because he feared for his life, and he defended himself, his mother, and the community against a very real threat, the giant. During our testimony, we will call a witness to the stand who will show that Jack has a strong moral character, that he loves all living creatures. This same witness also saw him descending the beanstalk, saw him tremble in fear, saw his face go ashen, and his hands shake. This is someone 5 times smaller than the giant, who was shaking at the bottom of the beanstalk. This was someone who acted because their life was in danger, there was a reasonable threat, and they used reasonable force. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is always a good guy and a bad guy to every story. And it has never been clearer who or what in this case is responsible for the horrible circumstances that bring us to this court today.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of Jack Henry Goldsmith. Now, Jack grew up in a small, impoverished coal mining community. At the age of only 3, his father passed away in a coal mining accident. To support the family and put food on the table, his mom worked odd jobs for long hours. As soon as Jack was old enough, he joined his mother, working alongside her after school. Now, as you all know, this winter has been particularly cold. And so, Jack's mother sent Jack to the market with the family's most prized possession, a cow. The cow was to be exchanged for wool that she would use to weave blankets to keep the family warm in the freezing winter. So, when Jack returned with 3 beans, she sent her son to bed, hungry and ashamed. Now, the next morning, Jack woke up, hungry, pillow stained with tears. As he crept out of his room, he found the family's small shack of a house engulfed in a giant beanstalk. And there, Jack saw his opportunity.
In the beanstalk, Jack saw his chance to provide for his mother. On the morning in question, he pulled on his worn boots, noticing first his mother's own shoes lying beside his, covered in holes. He crept across the old creaking floorboards of their house, and he walked out the door and then leapt for the beanstalk. He began to climb, pulling himself faster and faster, climbing further and further into the sky. When he finally reached the top of the beanstalk, he peered over the edge and saw the most magnificent castle he had ever seen. It was incomparable to the house that he and his mother lived in. He stumbled inside in bewilderment, finding gold coins covering the floor and lining the walls. He reached down and picked up some of the coins, letting them slip through his fingers, imagining what he could do with this kind of money for his mother. In this moment, Jack put some of the coins in his pocket. Although this was a mistake, it was not an act of malice. He was drawn further and further into the house by the wafting smells coming from the kitchen. When he finally arrived in the doorway of the kitchen, he saw two giants cooking their meal. But before he could enter, he was frozen. He heard a moan that chilled his bones and sent the hairs on his neck, that caused the hairs on his neck to rise. Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. With tears streaming down his face, Jack hid in the shadows, cowering, listening to the giant's wife try to convince him that he was imagining things. When Jack finally felt the ground begin to shake from the snores of the giant sleeping, he began to run. He ran for the safety of his home. He ran for the safety of his mother. He ran in desperation. But the giant heard him running.
Now, later in these proceedings, you'll hear from a witness who observed the events that followed firsthand, his 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Jones. Now, Mrs. Jones was visiting Jack this day because he had not been in school and she was concerned. And as she turned the street onto his and saw his home and the beanstalk, she saw Jack careening down this beanstalk, trying to escape the giant's fatal grasp. As he reached the bottom, he was crying for his mother, trembling in fear. She heard him cry, "Help! Mama, he's going to kill me. He's going to kill us both." As he stood there, eyes brimming with tears, his mother brought him an axe. She was scared. She didn't know what was going on. And Jack could barely hold this axe. He dropped it, not once, not twice, but 3 times before the beanstalk fell. And after it did fall, he stood there, frozen, shaking, trembling, as he looked at the giant, and then dropped the axe, and ran to find the village medicine man. He did not continue to harm the giant. He went and got help. Now, Mrs. Jones is not only Jack's teacher, but also the leader of the nature club, of which Jack is an active member. And she will testify that he could in no way ever intentionally harm another living being. Jack is selfless, and Jack has an insatiable curiosity for nature. Now, Mrs. Jones's testimony will demonstrate to you that there was no intention, Jack had no intention of harming the giant, and that any harm that came to the giant was and any of the actions that Jack took were out of self-preservation for himself and his mother.
The prosecution has tried to convince you that Jack's decision to cut down this beanstalk was premeditated. These claims are unfounded. Jack never had any intention of killing the giant, nor did he seek revenge upon this giant for stealing from the townspeople. In the heat of the moment, Jack cut down the beanstalk because in the heat of the moment, he had no other choice. Now, Jack is not blameless. He trespassed. He stole coins. But he will be the first to admit his fault to you. But that is where Jack's fault ends. He had no intention of killing this giant. A child shaking, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks, picked up an axe, and with every ounce of strength that he had, he hacked and he hacked at the beanstalk, just as the prosecution has said. But he did so because he thought he would die. We rightfully conclude that this was an instance of life or death, and that in this split second, he had no other option.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, these are the facts of the case. Jack didn't know what was at the top of the beanstalk. He had no plan. He went into a giant's home without a weapon. In fact, he didn't even know the beans would grow. Now, the prosecution has tried to persuade you into believing that this is a case about self-defense. And it isn't. But let's explore that argument for a second. The giant in the castle screamed, "I'll grind his bones to make my bread." They say it's not a death threat. Now, regardless of what the giant thought at that moment, that does not matter. What matters is what those words indicated to Jack. A man 5 times his size saying, "I'll grind his bones to make my bread." Now, the law clearly states that an individual may use reasonable force to defend himself or herself from danger. In this case, Jack heard a death threat and used less than reasonable force. But that's okay. Let's let that pass. Now let's get to what's important in this case, and that is intent. And they have also tried to convince you that there was premeditated intent. When the giant fell, Jack went to get help. It wasn't the town guard. It wasn't hunters. It was the village thug. And the giant is still here with us today because of what Jack did. Now, I want you to stop for a second and think of your brothers. Think of your sons one day. Or, better yet, think of yourselves looking up that beanstalk and a giant coming from you who has threatened your life, and you know is threatening the lives of everyone around you, including your own mother. Absolute fear. Now, this is a choice between life and death. But then again, there's no choice. And we do not send people to jail for standing up against danger, for defending themselves and the people that they love. We rest our case. Thank you.
Thank you. Court is now adjourned. All rise. And the jury may excuse themselves to go deliberate. Thank you.
You went off.